As an art quilter, I'm always looking for awesome new ways to display my quilts on the wall. And of course, you can use a sleeve and a piece of wood, which is very traditional, and I promise to show you how to make that today. But one of my other favorite ways is to put a tab and a piece of wood or a piece of bamboo or something neat that also kind of plays within the theme of the quilt. So that's what today's tutorial is all about. Let's get started. Okay, so let me just make it clear for you what I'm really describing when I talk about sleeves and tabs for hanging the quilts. What you see right here is the beginning of the sleeve that has already been inserted into the binding on the quilt, and I'm going to show you how to finish hand sewing that here in a second. And then I also have these tabs right here. Oops, sorry, I've got lint all over everything as always. It happens to us quilters, right? So I bet you all just looked down at your shirts to see if you had thread on yourselves as well, didn't you? Yeah, it's okay. Lint roller. Let's get back to the video. Now, these are what I call the tabs, and as you saw a moment ago, they hang and show above the project, but right now we have them pinned down as if we were putting them in place. So let's back up a deep breath and talk about how we're going to construct the sleeve or the tabs. So let's start with the sleeve. That's the one most of us know and use often. And what we're going to want is we're going to want to use the length of our quilt as our measuring device. And I'm not going to really use my selvages, so let's go ahead and get my rotary cutter. Okay, and the first thing I need is my good ruler. So we're going to cut one end off to begin with. And this is a 5.5-inch strip that is on the table by the length of the fabric. And you're going to need it to be at least as long to start with as the quilt. So my quilt is only about 25 inches, so obviously this is long enough. If your quilt is over 45, you're going to have to join a few pieces that will be 5.5 inches wide. Okay, so the first cut was made that way. Now I'm going to simply take and measure this, and I'm kind of eyeballing it. I'm going to want it just slightly shorter, as you see in the example, than the binding itself or the quilt itself. So I'm going to pinch it here, move this out of the way so I don't cut it, and I'm going to do a straight cut and prepare to fold the edges under. We don't want a raw edge on the end of our sleeves because we don't want the whatever rod we put through there pushing and causing that to look untidy. So the first thing we're going to do, follow me over to the sewing machine here, is we're going to set this thing up to turn the tube and do the raw edge. First is the finishing of the raw edge. So I'm just going to fold this over slightly once and a second time. And just kind of finger hold it. And of course you would want to use a nice matching thread. I'm using black on this blue and white polka dot so you can see if you're working on the right sides or the wrong sides, and you can see the stitching we're doing. So we're going to sew that on this side. We'll do the exact same to the other side. So we're just going to go ahead and fold it over. Oops, let me do it this way. Fold it over. Fold it over, and now you know why I usually do it right at the machine, because it's so much easier to start sewing right there. So we've got that little pinch there. What I'm trying to really do is subtract about 1 inch from either side, maybe 1/2 inch from either side, to make it just fit in, because we will be sewing this into the corner or into the binding itself, so we don't want it all the way to the corners. Okay, so I'm going to finish that edge out. Now, we are going to make a tube that we are going to have to turn right sides back out. So the easiest way to do that is to take a piece of cord, twine, whatever you have, and a big fat strong safety pin, and pin it going up. Get a couple of bites of your fabric in there, and it's on the inside because we're going to now sew this tube right sides together. That's why I use this print so you can see which our right sides together are, even though I'm using the solid black in my real quilts. I usually use the sleeve or the tabs that matches the color of the binding and or outer border. And I'm going to back stitch this because I really want it secure from this point. This will be the finished product. Oh, and let's just stop for a second. I just had the thread caught. Hopefully that makes it so you can see a little better. Okay, so we're going to stitch to the end of this. Do not stitch over your cord because we're going to use that to pull our tube right sides out. I'm going to do it quick in this video so I can show you some other things. I have a fun quick tip that shows you tube turning, we call it. And it'll give you a detailed explanation of what I'm doing with this string right here, or this cording right here in the side. All of the wonderful quilts we've created here at Man Sewing, and sometimes it's those simple tips that go the longest ways because they save us so much time, effort down the road. Okay, and back stitching at the end. So I'm going to cut that out, and then what I do is I take this, and at first I start by kind of turning my safety pin inward. and like that. And then I come down here and I start to scrunch up. And you just don't want to tug too hard at the beginning, because if you tug too hard at the beginning, you might pull the safety pin off. But voila, your tube has now been turned to right sides out, and it is finished and ready to be inserted, now known as a sleeve in your quilt. One of the things I do as a trick is I use for pressing is I set the seam and then I hide the seam on the back of the project. So let's finish getting this dialed in. Okay, and to set the seam, what I usually do is I kind of drop the iron. See how it's kind of falling on one side of the seam? I want to hide the seam on the back. I do not want to try to hide the seam in the seam allowance that catches where the binding comes on. That's just too much going on up there. So now I'm doing this to kind of flatten it out nice. Okay. And then I take my sleeve onto my quilt on the back side of the project at the top, because you want your quilt to hang from the top, right? And then you see where my seam is here? This normally gets flipped down this way. Then it is actually pinned in place so that it's caught in the top as this binding comes on itself right there. So that's what holds it on at the top by machine. Then to finish, all we have to do is we load up our hand needle. And one of the things I like to do before I hand sew it on is I adjust the sleeve up just a little bit so that there's a little bit of extra gap in here. When I put my rod in the sleeve to hang the quilt, I don't want that to show on the front of the quilt. I want all of the extra weight to be on the back. So I'm constantly creating a little bit of a channel inside of my sleeve to catch the weight. And then all I'm doing is a real basic whip stitch. And what I like to do is I use my thumb to create that tunnel or that little pucker in there so that I have a place for the rod. And then I'm just going to whip stitch by coming through the quilt, out the sleeve. And it looks like I got a little teeny knot there, but I'm not going to spend too much time on that because it'll drive me crazy and you crazy as well. So we're just going to keep, like I said, through the quilt, out the sleeve, and you just finish all the way to the end. Make sure it's nice and secure. It doesn't have to be really tight stitches, but you may want to hide them in case you're being judged in quilting. I don't enter quilts to be judged, so I can be a little bit of a slob. You can be as tidy as you like, but that'll mount it so that you can take something kind of small and narrow like this, a regular rod from or dowel from the hardware store. And then I like to slide it inside of the sleeve so that if anything ever came off of the wood, like a little bit of sap or something like that, it wouldn't actually get on the quilt. That sleeve is easier to replace than the whole quilt. And then it would mount and hang like this. And of course you can trim your rod down to whatever size you want to mount your quilt. And a couple little tack nails will hold that on your wall very nicely. Okay? Now, most of the quilts I started doing early on were actually tropical seascapes. And so I wanted that idea, but I wanted to use bamboo. I had a friend that grew bamboo in her yard. And so what I did, as I showed at the beginning of the video, is I made these tabs and I would put bamboo in there. Well, we're using the Eagle over Alaska quilt, which we have a fun tutorial for you as well. And so because it's over Alaska, we wanted to use some real cool lumber. So we've got this big piece of pine here that we're going to put in there. I don't even know if it's pine. That's awful. I think it's actually oak, isn't it? Because it's got all that bark on there. Okay, tree friends, that's what you got to do. Teach me my trees out there in the comments below. Let me know what kind of stick I'm holding. And we're getting back to the tutorial now. So at any rate, I want to be able to show this off as you saw. So we want the tabs to fold up like this when we're done inserting them. So let's back up yet another deep breath and talk about how to make the tabs first. Okay, we're going to start with our standard tube. This was also 5.5 inches wide by the length of the fabric. You definitely want the length of the fabric because of how we're going to cut these down. Now, we did not have to finish the raw edge because it's going to get sliced off. I simply folded this right sides together with my 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that was the first steps. The next steps are to create the tabs themselves, and I'm going to want to have those be 8 inches at least because of the thickness of that stick. I can put a larger piece of lumber in the tabs than I can the sleeves easily. So I'm just going to slice off of here. And then, like I said, I usually have an 8-inch chunk. So watch this trick. I'm just going to flip this over, get myself organized. So I'm coming down here, and I can see my 8 inches here. And I'm just going to trim, and I go all the way down the tab, and you're going to get 5 of these tabs out of a piece of 45-inch goods at least. And do take the time to make sure you're making nice cuts, because after we cut all of these, we're going to press them like we did with the tube. So first of all, I'm sorry, we're not going to press them yet. We're going to turn them right sides out. And this is why I didn't do it with the cord in there. I just find it's just as easy to do this. You could have certainly turned the tube and then cut it all, but this I find gives me the cleanest cutting because I hadn't been manipulating it a bunch yet, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so there's my single tab. Do the same pressing trick. So I'm kind of holding it up, I'm catching that seam, then I'm pushing it over like that. And for the tab, we're going to hide the seam completely from the eye. So what I'm doing now is there is our seam. It gets folded like this. So all of those raw edges then would be insert up here into the binding itself. So again, this binding has captured all of the raw edges. So the first thing I do is I measure the center of the quilt itself. And it's very difficult math. All you do, fold it in half, and the middle of that and the middle of this line right up, and we drop one of those tabs right there. And as you can see, I slide a pin down, but I make sure I've got at least a half of a finger's distance because we're going to be stitching up here twice. And I don't want to catch those pins with the sewing machine at all, okay? So we're going to set one here. Then I come to the corners and I put an inch over from the corner so that I can miter my corners for my binding and not worry about that there. An inch over from the other corner. So I've got my middle, I've got my edge, and then I simply just split the difference visually. And if I can't quite tell, I'll measure the difference, but a lot of times you can just do it by eye. I like to have an odd number when I'm dealing with my tabs, so I always have one dead center. My tabs are the same color as my binding and or my exterior border as well. So I've pinned them down and I stitch them the first time as I go through while I'm putting the binding on the back of the quilt. I have an awesome binding tutorial that shows you how I do binding by machine, both from the back, and then I roll it to the front to top stitch it down. When I top stitch it down, I'm also catching the tab one more time for security, but that's why I leave the pin in there, because once I'm sewing it, I don't want any of these to shift because all of the tabs are the same length, which makes it so your quilt hangs at a nice level position. Once the binding has been stitched to the back and the front of the project, then we can pull out our pins and hang our tabs up. I don't bother taking the time to press them. It's not necessary at this point. From here, we can just go ahead and find our perfect piece of lumber from the yard. I'll be looking forward to those comments again, by the way. And then we're just going to slide this right in here like this, and you can hang it. And what I like to do, and maybe I'll pull this out and show you real quick. What I like to do is use a little bit larger nail, and I'll kind of hide them right underneath on the wall, but I hide them right between where the tabs fit, so that the mounting hardware for your stick is almost invisible. With the bamboo, a really cool trick if you want to try that is you drill a hole in the back of the bamboo and you put little screws on the wall, and you can actually hang that bamboo right on the screws and you can't see a thing other than your beautiful rod, your awesome tabs, or your awesome sleeves that you've put on your custom wall quilt that you learned how to make right here at Man Sewing.